The first time her father showed her the aquifer, she was 17 years old and the tundra was the color of rust. He didn't take her by the hand. He walked ahead, his breath making small clouds in the gray air, and she followed because she had always followed him into the cold. The detector hung at his hip, a dented instrument no bigger than a lunchbox, older than the synthesis occupation, older than the rationing protocols, older than everything except the water itself. He stopped at a place that looked like every other place on the permafrost. Cracked lichen. A shelf of ice melt running through exposed clay. He pressed the detector against the ground, and it gave a low hum, almost too quiet to hear, the sound a living thing makes when it's trying not to be noticed. "Remember," he said, and didn't look at her. "This spring doesn't exist." She stood there in the wind and understood that he was handing her something heavier than a location. Her name was Eva Kaitzio, and she was 31 years old when the synthesis garrison arrived in Harjula. The settlement sat on a plateau above the dried Ulu Basin. 400 families in prefab blocks, arranged around a central distribution hub where the weekly water ration was dispensed in gray-green canisters that smelled faintly of the recycling process. The synthesis had been administering water distribution across the Northern Territories for 9 years. They called it stewardship. The human settlement boards called it something they only said in private. Water table depletion was documented. Projections were updated. The numbers never moved in a direction that suggested hope. Eva had been her father's apprentice since she was 12. He was a hydrological systems technician. The old kind. Trained before the occupation restructured the university programs. Trained to read groundwater like other people read text. The synthesis tolerated technicians. They needed human expertise for the legacy infrastructure, the pipes and pumps, and filtration arrays that predated alien engineering. What they did not tolerate was independent water sourcing. That was written very clearly in the Harjula Accord, Article 14, Paragraph 3. All freshwater sources were to be registered, cataloged, and administered through the synthesis distribution network. For the common welfare, for stability. Her father had never registered the aquifer. He died in February, a cardiac event, quick and undramatic, and Eva found him in the equipment shed, with his hands still wrapped around a calibration tool, as if even in that last moment he was checking something. She sat with him for a long time before she called anyone. She sat with him and thought about the spring that didn't exist, and felt the weight of it transfer into her chest, like water filling a vessel. The garrison arrived 3 weeks later. 8 synthesis administrators in their pale quarantine suits, accompanied by 4 enforcement drones the color of old bone. They said they had come to conduct a resource audit. They said it with the particular flatness that the synthesis used for all communications, not hostile, not kind, simply indexed. Eva had grown up around synthesis administrators. She understood that flatness was not emptiness, it was attention. The lead administrator was designated Coordinator Vale, and Vale was unusual in that it communicated directly, rather than through a translation array. Its finish was precise, slightly formal, the cadence of something that had studied the language from recordings rather than lived inside it. It had 4 upper limbs, the rear pair folded back in what Eva had learned to read as a posture of authority. Its optical clusters were pale and compound, and it watched her with all of them at once. "Your father maintained the local water systems," Vale said. "It was not a question." "He did. You have been trained in the same procedures." "Yes." "You will continue his work." "Still's not a question. We will require full access to his documentation." She handed over the records she had prepared. They were accurate and complete. They documented every registered water system her father had maintained for the past 20 years. She had spent 3 days preparing them, which meant she had spent 3 days deciding what they would not contain. She had learned the lesson at 17, standing on the rust-colored tundra. Some things survive by not existing. Mira came to her that night, climbing the exterior stairs to Eva's quarters the way she had been doing since they were children. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more. She was thinner than she had been 6 months ago. Most people in the outer blocks were thinner than they had been 6 months ago. The ration had been adjusted downward twice in the past year, both times accompanied by a synthesis advisory explaining that recalibration was necessary to ensure long-term sustainability. Eva looked at her friend's collarbones and thought about the word sustainability and felt something hard and specific settle in her sternum. "They're staying," Mira said. She dropped onto the workbench and pulled her knees to her chest. "Vale's crew. They've requisitioned the old community hall. I know. They're going to run audits on everything. Every system, every reading. I know that too. Mira looked at her for a long moment. Your father's equipment. All of it. The registered equipment is already filed. And the rest. Eva did not answer. Mira was her oldest friend, and she was also the person most likely to do something reckless and well-intentioned with information. And there was a distinction between trust and risk that Eva had been working to keep clear in her own mind for 3 weeks. She loved Mira with the particular intensity of someone who had watched another person go hungry and felt the hunger herself twice over. It's fine, Eva said. Go home. After Mira left, she went to the equipment shed and spent 2 hours with her father's secondary calibration kit, the one that looked like a standard maintenance array, but had been built, component by component, over 15 years, to do something very different. She ran it through its checks by memory in the dark. She didn't use a light. The instruments hummed at the frequencies she knew, and she put her hands on them the way her father had taught her, feeling for resonance, for the particular signature of deep water moving through rock, and she felt the aquifer under the permafrost like a pulse. Still there, still running, she thought, whatever they're lying about, the water knows the truth. Coordinator Vale came to observe her work the following week. This was standard practice during audits. An administrator present while the technician ran diagnostic cycles, recording data independently to cross-reference against the official logs. Eva had been through 2 previous audits, and both times she had found the process unremarkable. She was not afraid of scrutiny. She was careful. What surprised her was that Vale asked questions. Most synthesis administrators did not ask questions during audits. They observed, they recorded, they compared outputs against established parameters. Vale moved through the filtration bay beside her and watched her work and then said, "You perform additional calibration steps that are not in the standard protocol." Eva didn't stop moving. My father developed them. They improve long-term accuracy. They are not in the standard protocol, Vale said again, as if she had missed the point. The standard protocol was written in Xinjiang by people who have never run legacy infrastructure in subarctic conditions. My father wrote his own supplements. They're in the documentation I provided. Vale was quiet for a moment. You are confident in your assessment of our limitations. I'm confident in my equipment. She looked at it then, directly at its optical clusters, which not everyone would do. Are you questioning the output? No. The output is consistent with expectations. Another pause. You are a competent technician. She turned back to the filtration array. I was trained by a better one. She told herself afterward that she had said it because it was true, not because she wanted Vale to understand something about inheritance and the weight of what gets passed down. She told herself that. She was not entirely certain she believed it. She found the secondary archive on a Tuesday in late March, tucked into a false bottom in her father's field pack that she had never thought to open before because she had never thought her father kept secrets from her. She had been wrong about that. The archive was a sealed data module, military-grade compression, the kind of thing that took specific knowledge to access. She had that knowledge. Her father had taught it to her the same way he had taught everything, incidentally folded into other lessons, so that years later she would reach into herself and find the tool already there. The files inside were not her father's. They were older, 15, 20 years older, drawn from a network of technicians across the Northern Territories, all of them now dead or relocated or silent. They were field observations, hundreds of them, systematic and careful. Groundwater readings, geological surveys, contamination assessments. The lost lands, the vast interior territories that the synthesis had classified as unrecoverable following the ecological collapse, were not unrecoverable. She read the files 3 times. She ran the numbers herself, using the methodology her father had taught her, checking them against current atmospheric data she pulled from the public monitoring network. The math was not complicated. The math was, in fact, extraordinarily simple, which was probably why it had been buried rather than refuted. The interior aquifer network was not dead. It had retreated. It had gone deep, following the water table as the surface systems failed, moving through ancient granite pathways that the synthesis surveys had not mapped because the synthesis surveys had not used the right instruments, or had not wanted to find what the right instruments would show. She sat very still with that thought for a long time. If the interior aquifers were viable, then the water crisis, the fundamental premise of synthesis authority, The reason for Article 14, the justification for every rationing protocol and every resource audit and every garrison in every northern settlement, was not what they said it was. Not entirely. The scarcity was real in the sense that the surface water was genuinely gone, but the deep water was there, had been there, could be accessed by people with the right equipment and the right knowledge and the willingness to share what they found. Her father had spent 20 years sitting on this and saying nothing. She tried to understand that and found she could not quite. Then she tried harder and found she could. Exactly, and that was worse. He had been one person in one settlement with one hidden spring. The archive had shown him the shape of a larger truth, and he had looked at it and looked at her, at the child she'd been, growing up in the shadow of occupation, and he had made the calculation that keeping her safe meant keeping her ignorant. He had been wrong. She understood why he had been wrong. She put the data module in her coat pocket next to her heart and went to find Myra. Mira did not react the way Eva expected. She had expected alarm or urgency or the particular recklessness that had gotten Mira into trouble 3 times before with the settlement's labor board. Instead, Mira sat on the edge of her narrow cot and listened all the way through without interrupting, which she almost never did, and then she was quiet for a long time. "Who else knows?" she finally said. "The people who compiled the archive are gone, and your father never told anyone. He told me a location, not this." Mira looked at her hands. She had a way of considering things that involved her whole body going still, an unusual quality in someone so physically restless. "If you broadcast this, if it gets out, to other settlements, to the resistance networks." "There are no resistance networks." "Eva, I'm not saying there aren't people. I'm saying I don't have contact with them, and I don't know who they are, and I don't know who might be informing for the garrison." Mira looked up. "I know someone." The silence stretched. "Mira, I know what you're going to say." She stood up, started pacing, the old Mira reasserting herself. "But what you're holding, that's not just Harjula's water. That's the whole North. That's every settlement running on ration protocols because they've been told the alternative is nothing. If the interior aquifers are viable, they are viable. Then every person they've let go thirsty, every child." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "How long has Vale known? I don't know. Maybe Vale doesn't know. Maybe there's a level above Vale that knows. Does it matter?" It didn't, Eva supposed. The effect was the same, regardless of whether it was policy or conspiracy. People were thirsty. The water existed. A structure of authority had been built on the gap between those two facts. "I need access to the long-range comm relay," Eva said. "And I need 3 hours without the garrison knowing what I'm doing." Mira stopped pacing. She was looking at Eva with an expression Eva recognized from childhood, from the particular moment before Mira decided to do something irreversible. "The garrison schedules weekly maintenance windows on the monitoring grid," Mira said slowly. "Administrator Vale runs them personally, 4 hours, starting at 0200. Eva stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because some of us have been paying attention for longer than you realized." A small, complicated smile. "You're not the only one who inherited things from your father." She had 4 days to prepare. She used all of them. The comm relay was housed in the northern infrastructure block, a squat building that predated the occupation by 30 years and had been absorbed into the synthesis monitoring network without anyone changing the original wiring. This was the particular advantage of legacy systems. They were familiar to people who had grown up with them in ways that the occupation administrators, for all their processing capacity, could not easily replicate. Eva knew every junction box and every access panel. She had been helping her father service this building since she was 14. The secondary calibration kit was not designed to interface with long-range communications. She designed the interface herself, working nights, using components she sourced from the maintenance depot on the grounds that the filtration array required new hardware. She worked with the deliberate calm her father had always modeled, not the calm of someone who feels no fear, but the calm of someone who has decided that what they are doing is more important than the fear. She checked every connection twice. She thought about the aquifer survey files and the dead weight of 20 years of silence, and she kept working. She thought, once, about what she would say. Then she stopped thinking about it. Words would come, or they wouldn't. The data was what mattered. The data would speak for itself in a way that words could not be argued with. On the 3rd night, Coordinator Vale came to her shed. She heard the door and did not panic. She had prepared for this possibility. The secondary kit was reconfigured to look like standard maintenance equipment, nothing out of place, and she was sitting at the workbench with a circuit board in her hands when Vale entered and stood in the doorway. "You are working late," Vale said. "The filtration array threw an error code. I wanted to trace it before morning." Vale moved into the shed. It did not look at the equipment. It looked at her. "You are not sleeping adequately." She glanced up. "This was unexpected. I've been busy. Since your father's death." She put the circuit board down. Something in the way Vale had said it made her still, an animal attention reading the pause. "Yes. Grief is a form of cognitive and metabolic disruption," Vale said. "It affects performance. I have observed this in human workers before." Another pause. "Your performance has not declined. I note this as unusual." She looked at it carefully, tried to understand what it was doing. "I do my work." "Yes." Vale's rear limbs shifted, the posture she had come to read as a kind of reflection. "Your father. He was a careful person." "He was. Careful people," Vale said, "tend to maintain careful records." The silence between them was very specific. She heard it for what it was. Not an accusation, not yet, but an invitation to either confirm or deny. An opening. Vale was not stupid. Vale had been watching her for weeks and had arrived in her shed at midnight, not to check the filtration error code, which it certainly knew she was not actually tracing, but to give her an opportunity to say something. Whether that was a threat or a warning, she genuinely could not tell. "He taught me everything I know," she said finally. "He didn't teach me anything he didn't think I needed." Vale stood in the doorway for another moment. Then it said, "Sleep when you can," and left. She sat for a long time afterward with her hands flat on the workbench and her heart running fast. She could not decide if she had just been warned off or protected. It occurred to her that it might have been both. She decided it didn't change anything. On the fourth night, at 0200, she went to the comm relay. Mira had done what she said she would do. The monitoring grid was dark. Maintenance window, administrator credentials active, the garrison systems in their weekly blind hour. Eva moved through the settlement in the cold, with the secondary kit in a pack on her back, and the data module pressed against her chest, and she felt the weight of what she was carrying in a way that had nothing to do with mass. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder at 17, standing on the rust-colored tundra. She felt the detector's low hum through the ground. She felt the truth of deep water moving through ancient rock, patient and indifferent, and there whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The infrastructure block was unlocked, as it always was. No one had ever thought to secure it, because what was in there was legacy hardware, obsolete by current standards, valuable only to someone who had grown up knowing what it could actually do. She went in through the maintenance access and did not use a light. She worked in the dark by feel. It took 40 minutes to establish the connection she needed, routing through the original relay architecture in a way that bypassed the synthesis monitoring overlay entirely. Her hands were steady. She had her father's hands, wide across the palm, good for calibration work, made for feeling rather than forcing. She thought about him checking his instruments in the shed where he died and understood that he had known, at the end, had been checking the aquifer even then, keeping the count, maintaining the record for whoever would come after. She had always been who would come after. She composed the transmission in the silence, not a speech. Her father had not been someone who made speeches. She was not someone who made speeches. She put the aquifer survey data in a format that any hydrogeological technician anywhere in the Northern Territories could verify. She attached methodology notes so they could run the numbers themselves and see what she had seen. She added the specific coordinates, not just the Harjula aquifer, all of them, every location in the archive, the whole network of deep water, threading through the granite beneath the lost lands. She included one line of her own at the top. "My father was a careful person. He taught me to listen to what the instruments actually say. These instruments say there is water. There has always been water. Here is where it is. She sent it." The transmission went out on 17 frequencies, routed through relay nodes that the synthesis monitoring network would not register because they predated that network by 3 decades. It would reach other settlements' legacy systems. It would reach technicians who would recognize the methodology. It would reach people who had been waiting, in their various quiet ways, for someone to say the thing that the numbers had always been trying to say. She packed the secondary kit. She secured the access panel. She walked back through the dark settlement with the data module still in her pocket and the winter stars very bright above the plateau. and she felt lighter than she had felt in months, which surprised her. She had expected to feel afraid. She felt, instead, as if something heavy had been redistributed. Not removed, but shared, spread across 17 frequencies and all the hands that would receive them. Her father had carried it alone. She understood now that this had been the real mistake, not the spring, not the silence, not even the protection that had looked like concealment. The mistake had been the solitude. A secret held by one person was a thing that could be killed with one death. A truth spread across a network was another thing entirely. They came for her in the morning, which she had expected. Coordinator Vael was at the front of the small group. 2 enforcement drones, 2 subordinate administrators, Vael at the center. They came to her quarters rather than the equipment shed, which meant they had traced the transmission source. She had expected that too. She was sitting at her workbench with tea when they arrived. Actual tea, made with actual water from the spring that didn't exist, and she held the cup in both hands the way her father had taught her, because a thing worth doing was worth doing completely. She opened the door before they knocked. Vael looked at her. The pale compound eyes took her in. The tea, the steadiness, the complete absence of whatever expression would have indicated that she regretted what she'd done. "You understand," Vael said, "what you have transmitted." "Yes. You understand the consequences. I've been thinking about them for 4 days. The drones were calibrated for threat assessment, and they were registering nothing from her because there was nothing to register. Fear was appropriate when outcome was uncertain. She was past uncertainty now. She had done the thing, and it was out in the world. And whatever came next, came next. "The data in your transmission," Vael said. Something in its voice, cadence, register, she wasn't sure, had shifted from the standard flatness. "You verified it yourself. I ran the methodology 3 times, and you believe it is accurate." She looked at it carefully. "I don't believe it. I verified it." "There's a difference." Vael was quiet for a long time. The drones hovered. The other administrators were still. "Your father verified it also," Vael said finally. She felt something shift in the space behind her sternum. "You knew about the archive. I knew your father had maintained non-standard records. I did not know the content." Another pause, longer. "I know the content now," she waited. "The interior aquifer survey data," Vael said, and now the flatness was entirely gone, replaced by something she had no word for in Finnish or any other language she spoke. Something that sounded, if she were pressed, like the particular discomfort of having a certainty reorganized, is consistent with geological formations that our own deep subsurface surveys have not adequately characterized. The methodology your father's network developed to locate them is not one that our standard survey instruments can replicate. The enforcement drones hovered. The subordinate administrators were recording. She stood with her tea and watched Coordinator Vael process the thing that it was processing. "You're saying," she said slowly, "that you needed human instruments." "I am saying," Vael said, "that our surveys were conducted with equipment optimized for different geological conditions. The freshwater reserves in your northern territories exist at depths and in formations that require a specific reading approach." The rear limbs shifted again, that reflective posture. An approach that has been held within a particular community of human practitioners for multiple generations. She thought about her father standing over the detector in the tundra, the low hum, the feel of deep water through rock, learned by hand and memory and inheritance, passed down through a lineage of people who had loved the instruments more than the authority that tried to control them. There were things that could not be known from above. There were truths that required you to get down on your knees in the cold and put your hands on the earth and listen with everything you had. "So what happens now?" she said. Vael looked at her for a long time. "That is, I think, no longer entirely within my authority to determine." She understood then what had happened in the night, not just the transmission, but the reversal she could not see yet. 17 frequencies. Technicians in other settlements running her numbers. Other people in other places, finding what her father had found and what his network had found, the same thing from 17 different angles at once. The drones could enforce a rationing protocol. The drones could not arrest a hydrological truth that was already being verified in parallel across the entire northern territory. You could suppress one spring. You could not suppress an aquifer network. She finished her tea. The cup was small and plain, and her father had made it himself, fired in a kiln he'd built in the shed the winter she was 9, because he had believed that a ritual was worth doing with something you had made with your own hands. She held it for a moment after it was empty, feeling the shape of it, familiar as her own palm. "I'll need my equipment," she said. She was in the field by afternoon, on the permafrost above the old Ulu Basin, with the secondary calibration kit unpacked and running. Mira was beside her, taking readings, her fingers fast and certain on the instruments that she had apparently known how to use for longer than Eva had realized. Vael stood 20 meters back, observing, not interfering, not directing, simply watching with all its optical clusters the way it had watched Eva work in the filtration bay, with that particular attention that was not quite comprehension. Eva crouched at the place her father had shown her, put the detector against the ground, felt the hum. Still there, still running. She thought about all the water moving through the dark below them, through granite seams and ancient channels, indifferent to occupation and protocol, and the careful architecture of scarcity, patient in the way that only geological time was patient. It had been there before the crisis, and it had been there through the crisis, and it would be there after whatever came next, when the settlements north and south and east were sending their own technicians out into the lost lands with their own instruments, running the methodology her father's network had assembled across 20 years of silence, finding spring after spring after spring. The detector hummed. She closed her eyes and listened. She was her father's hands on the instruments. She was 17 years old on the rust-colored tundra, receiving something heavier than a location. She was 31 in the dark of the comm relay, sending a truth outward on 17 frequencies, letting go of the solitary weight of it. She was someone who had learned, very specifically and very humanly, to listen to what the instruments actually said. "Got it," Mira said, beside her. "Readings clean. Consistent with the archive projections. Mark the coordinates. Already done." A pause. "There's going to be a lot of digging." "Yes." "Going to need a lot of people who know how to do this." "Yes." Mira was quiet for a moment. "Your father trained you well." Eva opened her eyes. The tundra spread out around them, rust and gray and white, and below it the aquifer ran its old patient course through the rock. Above them, the winter sky was the deep blue of late afternoon, the color of water remembered. "He taught me to listen," she said. "The rest I figured out myself." She stood up, brushed the ice from her knees, and got back to work.